In my previous video, I explained why I thought a return to lockdowns and mandates was possible. In this video, I'll explain why I think it's probable. Before we begin though, I'd like to give a shout out to Mikey the Archangel, who left some encouraging comments on a couple of my videos. Thank you for your kind words, and I hope you enjoy this one. Today I want to look at some recent articles. Now, I don't like the mainstream media, and if you're watching this video, you probably don't either. For a while I stopped consuming mainstream media altogether, but in 2020 I realized I had to keep an eye on it if I wanted to stay ahead of developments. Mainstream media is where the establishment announces its plans. It's where they drop hints. It's where they publish the lies they want the public to believe. Today I want to show you how I read, how I use, how I observe and analyze the mainstream media. So let's take a look at our first article. An August surge. 2 new variants and a Barbenheimer spike. Is London facing a COVID autumn? I saw a Guardian article this morning that was also pushing the Barbenheimer superspreader theory. This is the same rubbish they were peddling in 2020. Large gatherings spread the virus. Stay indoors. Avoid crowds. Of course, the dreaded superspreader event never materialized, but that never stopped them from repeating the lie. The subtitle reads, "Cases have surged by 17% in the last week, with experts blaming waning immunity, increased indoor mixing, and new mutations." So they've revived the case-demic. They're reporting on rising cases, trying to gin up fear. They're using emotionally charged words like surged instead of increased or something neutral. They've also got the staple cliches of waning immunity, increased indoor mixing, and new mutations. Now I'd like to take a closer look at this picture. Isn't it disturbingly similar to what we would have seen at the height of the COVID regime? It's designed to instill fear. Look how the virus is everywhere on that crowded train carriage. There are also cues to remember social distancing, testing, and wearing a mask, even if you're riding a bike like the guy in the top left. They want us to remember what we did in 2020. I think because they want us to go back to that. Let's take a look at this article from MarketWatch. New coronavirus variant has experts on alert, and WHO is urging countries to step up COVID surveillance. A new variant of the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus has put epidemiologists around the world on alert, and the World Health Organization is asking countries to sustain early warning, surveillance, and reporting systems as it works to evaluate the current COVID-19 risk level. Stepping up surveillance is a common theme I've noticed in many recent articles. Why do they want increased surveillance? Because they want to bring back the case-demic. If they look for more cases, they'll find them. Do you remember those daily press conferences reporting on case numbers, hospitalizations, and deaths? Remember the old charts of doom with an exponential curve? They used to make out that the growth of cases would continue indefinitely unless they brought in restrictions. Otherwise, increased cases would lead to increased hospitalizations, which would lead to increased deaths. Of course, the number of cases would eventually crest and fall, as they always did, and then they would attribute the falling cases to the success of lockdowns and face masks. A case-demic will give them the pretext to reintroduce mandates. Reading on, paragraph 3. The variant has more than 30 mutations in the spike protein compared with the XBB variants that are currently dominant in the US and around the world. So this is an old trick from 2020 and 2021, deploying the new variant to scare the pants off people. The latest scariant has 30 mutations. Paragraph 5. But BA 2.86 is worrying experts because there is too little data to assess its potential impact. There is too little data to assess its potential impact, even though there's no evidence to believe it will be any worse than any other strain. This is a tried and tested tactic from the height of the so-called pandemic. Seed doubt in people's minds. Seed fear of the unknown. They want you to think, wouldn't it be safer to assume the worst until we know otherwise? Wouldn't it be safer to wear a mask? Wouldn't it be safer to isolate? Shouldn't we err on the side of caution? Reading on. It is crucial to sustain early warning, surveillance, and reporting, variant tracking, early clinical care provision, administration of vaccine boosters to high-risk groups, improvements in ventilation, and regular communication, the agency said in its latest weekly update. They don't want us to dismantle the old pandemic infrastructure. They want it in place permanently. Back to the article. That update, which reviews the state of the virus for the 28-day period through August 20, contains no data from the WHO's region of the Americas, as reports for the period were incomplete. That's a worry that the WHO has consistently warned about as countries pull back on their monitoring of the illness as they seek to put the pandemic behind them. There it is, loud and clear. They don't want you to put the pandemic behind you. They don't want you to live with the virus. They're telling you they want the COVID regime to be the status quo. Skipping down to the final paragraph, they have to end on a note of doom, reporting the increased hospitalizations and deaths, another common theme lately. Separately, the CDC reported a 21.6% increase in US hospitalizations for COVID in the week through August 12. Deaths rose 21.4% in the week through August 19. So this article was propaganda, very similar fare to what you might have read in 2020. The author's intent is to stoke fear. Now, I sometimes hear people say you shouldn't share mainstream articles. You're just spreading the fear. You're amplifying their message. Now, I don't want anyone to panic. I just want people to be aware of what's coming down the line. We don't need to fear a virus, but after the last 3 years, we should have a healthy fear of tyranny and a realistic view of our fellow citizens. Sadly, most of them are weak, afraid, and gullible. We need to have our eyes open so that we can prepare. If you ignore the mainstream media, you'll be ignorant of what the establishment is planning, and ignorant of the mood of the masses. These things affect us. 2020 taught us that we can't afford to be ignorant. We're looking critically at these articles. We're removing the noise. We're extracting information. Let's take a look at this Guardian article. Political support for surveillance of COVID waning in Australia despite waves of mutations, scientists say. Active community testing required on an intermittent basis to see the whole iceberg, not just the tip, Professor Catherine Bennett says. There's a Titanic reference there, obviously. They're catastrophizing. Paragraph 1 reads, political momentum for the monitoring and surveillance of COVID-19 is fading, the Australian virologist who developed a world-first method for rapidly isolating and characterizing variants said. So The Guardian is calling for political action, political momentum for the science they want done. Just like in 2020, the media is calling on the government to act. They want the public to follow their lead and begin lobbying the government. There is another article calling for political action. Global COVID monitoring is crashing as BA 2.86 variant raises alarm. This is on the shoulders of government right now. This is on the shoulders of governments right now. The establishment is appealing to the establishment. They're appealing to governments to increase COVID monitoring. They're turning a sniffle into a political issue. This one is shameless fear porn. Hector Sains is one of just 2 Australians that needed a lung transplant because of COVID. Hector Sains is one of 2 people in a nation of 25 million who needed a lung transplant after COVID. In other words, your chances of needing a lung transplant are 1 in 12.5 million. Unfortunately, the average reader has a nanny-statist outlook. His mind will be fertile ground for the suggestion that we should rearrange society to protect people from such a vanishingly slim risk. The subtitle reads, "Don't tell Hector Sains COVID is just like a bad cold." They want you to think COVID is more serious than it really is. In 2020, you couldn't compare COVID to the flu. In 2023, you can't compare COVID to a cold. I've been getting a lot of articles like this in my newsfeed. It doesn't matter if you don't have access behind the paywall. They're trying to create an impression by bombarding people with doomer headlines. Most people just skim the headlines anyway. Here's an article tailored to prime us for lockdown, mentioning it in the title. Just what you wanted to hear. Team of government scientists, including Professor Lockdown, Neil Ferguson, warn new COVID variant Parola might be spreading rapidly around the world. They're trotting out Professor Neil Ferguson again, who engineered Britain's first lockdown. Here's proof that they can recycle the same discredited so-called experts and people will buy it. The public has a short memory. No matter how many false predictions experts make, they never seem to lose credibility. No matter how many correct predictions conspiracy theorists make, they never seem to gain credibility. Next article. These are the COVID-19 symptoms to look for as new variants spread, according to an expert. According to Adeem Azhar, the symptoms of the two new COVID-19 variants are actually similar to the original strain. Symptoms include cough, sore throat, runny nose, sneezing, fatigue, headache, muscle aches, and altered sense of smell. The symptoms are mild and similar to the original strain according to the article. So if you have a sniffle, maybe it's a hay fever, maybe it's cold, but they want you thinking, could this be COVID? Could this be the new strain? Maybe I should get tested. They want COVID to be front and center in your mind. They want you to be hypervigilant, hypersensitive to the mildest symptoms. And just like with surveillance, where if they look for COVID, they'll find it. Similarly, if people are looking for COVID symptoms, they'll find COVID symptoms. They're trying to inflate case numbers. This is from The Independent. COVID cases double in a month as scientists warn about the spread of new variants. Hospital admissions are also said to have increased after the discovery of Erin and Parola strains. This is dated the 24th of August, and the caption beneath the picture reads, "Some scientists have called for the return of face masks." This picture looks like it's from 2020. They want us to remember how we lived back then. They want us to go back to those habits. It looks like there's a subtle hint that masks should be mandatory again. The sign in the picture says you can be fined up to £6,400 for not wearing a mask on public transport. A lot of people just skim the headlines and glance at the pictures. Some people probably come away from this thinking mask mandates are back. There are also Christmas decorations in the shop window too. Remember when Christmas was cancelled? Remember what happens if people don't comply? Here's a sensationalist headline from the Daily Mail. Biggest surge in COVID deaths this year. Number dying due to virus jumps 57% in a week, with experts already calling for the return of masks. The previous articles called for increased surveillance. This article calls for a return to masking. The Daily Mail is traditionally right-leaning, so this current wave of propaganda is coming from both sides of the left-right spectrum. Anecdotally, I've noticed a lot more people wearing masks lately. This is how it started last time. The traditionally left-leaning Guardian is also peddling mask wearing. Americans at high risk advised to wear masks as new COVID variant detected. Then there's this article from the National Post. Everything we know about Parola, the new COVID variant in Canada and around the world. Parola is being tracked because it is the most highly mutated version of COVID since Omicron, but so far it isn't a variant of concern. How did this happen? Viruses mutate all the time. Well, if they mutate all the time, then it's completely normal, completely unremarkable. They're making a mountain out of a molehill. Skipping down to the second paragraph, what's the worry? The concern is that this variant may be more efficient at evading the immune responses of people who have COVID antibodies, either through previous infection or vaccination or both. This is not to say these people are at greater risk of illness. So they are harping on about immune escape again. It's the same recycled propaganda from the height of needle mania in 2021. It's the same problem we've always had with the inoculations. They're ineffective against new mutations. The media always predict the sky is going to fall, but it never does. The final sentence applies to basically no one. It reads, "It can of course also infect people who are neither vaccinated nor previously infected, and who therefore have no specific COVID immune response at all." By this stage, everyone has either been infected or inoculated. This one is weird. Posted 18 hours ago. Notice the comments are turned off. UK Statistics Office revises up strength of post-COVID bounce back. But if we scroll down, you'll notice it's a recycled article from 2021. Britain's Statistics Office said on Friday that it was revising up its estimate of the size of the country's economy at the end of 2021, pointing to a stronger bounce back from the COVID-19 pandemic than previously estimated. Why are they reposting this? Perhaps to make us think lockdowns weren't so bad after all. They weren't so damaging. The economy will bounce back. The economy is doing great right now. I've also seen a few articles reminding us that bird flu is a threat. Bird flu warning signs, what to look out for. A viral infection that spreads among birds and rarely affects humans. So why do they want us to watch out for symptoms then? The symptoms present similar to normal flu, such as runny nose, sore throat, and fever. So the symptoms are pretty generic and similar to COVID. Under causes, it says, caused by the influenza A virus, H5N1. Bird flu results in a respiratory tract disease that can be fatal in a majority of cases. So if you have COVID symptoms, they want you worried that you might have the deadly bird flu. I'm not sure where they're going with this, whether they're planning a bird flu pandemic. It may just be that they want people to be neurotic over the slightest sign that they might be sick. The article goes on. Under highlights it says, certain types can be dangerous or life-threatening. Urgent medical attention recommended. The H5N1 strain is said to be more highly pathogenic than any other subtype of influenza A virus. Vaccines are stockpiled with the US federal government and World Health Organization to be used in pandemic cases. This is pure propaganda. They want us thinking that pandemics happen regularly and we could have another one at any time. They seem to be priming us for a bird flu pandemic at some point. I also spotted another article about bird flu. UK should be preparing for bird flu pandemic, scientist warns. The UK should be preparing for a bird flu pandemic amid concerns the virus could jump to humans, a leading public health expert has warned. So they want us preparing for the next pandemic. Professor D.V. Sridhar, a chair of global public health at Edinburgh University, said it is too early to say what will cause the next outbreak. So they don't know what will cause the next outbreak, but they know there will be an outbreak. The article continues, but there are signals that there is a pattern emerging in avian flu's mutations, which means it could take off among humans at some point, according to the researcher who advised the Scottish government during the COVID crisis. So they want us worried about bird flu mutations, just like they want us worried about COVID mutations. They're playing on doubt again. We don't know when it will happen. We don't know how bad it will be. And notice the connection with the COVID regime. Professor D.V. Sridhar advised the Scottish government during the so-called COVID crisis. They're planning a continuation of the COVID regime under a new name. The article continues. She called for the nation to prepare to avoid a high death toll and disruptive restrictions which brought the country to a halt during the coronavirus pandemic. In other words, if we don't prepare, or if we don't have enough time to prepare, we will have to bear disruptive restrictions. The ongoing bird flu outbreak, caused by the H5N1 strain, has seen up to 1 million birds struck down. Struck down is sensationalist language. Struck down by the virus, with experts fearing it is on the brink of spreading among people. 4 British poultry workers have already tested positive for the strain this year. The virus is usually picked up through close contact with an infected bird. The rest of the article is more of the same. You get the picture. But they are really pushing this. I wonder if they can't get COVID restrictions back if we'll suddenly see bird flu cross over to humans and become the next pandemic. Next article. This one came out a week ago. COVID comeback? Health experts express concerns as summer nears its end. Starting at the second paragraph. Across the nation, health workers are witnessing a concerning rise in cases of the deadly virus. So they're referring to COVID as a deadly virus again, which is a lie. It's fear-mongering. This could have been written in 2020, but it's from a week ago. Paragraph 4. We don't know the exact number because people often don't report results when they test at home, Dr. Dora Ann Mills, Chief Health Improvement Officer for Maine Health, said. COVID-19 is here for the rest of our lifetimes. It's becoming much more routine, like the flu, but it is much more severe than the flu. Saying that it's much more severe than the flu is another lie. Even the original strain of COVID had an infection fatality rate comparable to a bad flu season. Current strains are even less deadly if you believe the studies. Now, I don't know what to believe in that regard. I know some people say COVID doesn't exist, and I'm open to that possibility. At the beginning of 2020, I was willing to accept that coronavirus existed, but I didn't think it was anywhere near as deadly as they were making out. But whenever I spoke against restrictions, people would call me a COVID denier. They would ask me if I believed the virus exists. I found it strange that it was so important to affirm a belief in the existence of the virus. It's like they were overselling it, which actually caused me to begin doubting its existence. I've also heard some people say viruses don't exist at all. I've heard others say that viruses do exist, but they don't cause disease. They're a symptom of disease. They feed off toxins when you're sick. I don't know what to make of these theories either. I'm open to all possibilities. I know that so-called science is hopelessly compromised and we have to challenge even the most basic assumptions. But in this video, for simplicity, I'm going to talk as if COVID exists. Now, getting back to the article, there are new variants coming out of COVID-19, and I've already had my first positive case even before the school year has started, she said. I wouldn't be surprised if new guidelines were issued, so she's floating the idea of restrictions being brought back, priming people for it. While schools currently do not mandate COVID-19 boosters, Mills announced that a new booster shot will be available in September. So there's a subtle hint there that maybe we should be mandating boosters for school children. Why bring it up otherwise? Continuing with the article, getting these annual boosters will become as common as getting a flu shot, Mills said. They don't want to let the COVID regime go. They want at least an annual ritual as a reminder that it will be with us forever. They want to normalize the abnormal. Back to the article. Discussing the potential impact of repeated COVID-19 infections, Mills stressed the importance of vaccination. We don't fully know the long-term impact of getting COVID repeatedly, she said. It's worth noting we also don't know the long-term impact of getting the needle repeatedly. She continues, I urge everyone to get the vaccine because it will protect you much better than getting the illness itself. That's another lie. Natural immunity is much better. This study was published in April 2022. SARS-CoV-2 naturally acquired immunity versus vaccine-induced immunity. Reinfections versus breakthrough infections, a retrospective cohort study. Waning of protection against infection with SARS-CoV-2 conferred by 2 doses of the vaccine begins shortly after inoculation and becomes substantial within 4 months. With that, the impact of prior infection on incident SARS-CoV-2 reinfection is unclear. Therefore, we examined the long-term protection of naturally acquired immunity, protection conferred by previous infection, compared to vaccine-induced immunity. And the result was SARS-CoV-2 naive vaccinees had a 13.06-fold increased risk for breakthrough infection with the Delta variant, compared to unvaccinated previously infected individuals when the first event, infection or vaccination, occurred during January and February of 2021. The increased risk was significant for symptomatic disease as well, when allowing the infection to occur at any time between March 2020 and February 2021. Evidence of waning naturally acquired immunity was demonstrated, although SARS-CoV-2 naive vaccinees still had a 5.96-fold increased risk for breakthrough infection and a 7.13-fold increased risk for symptomatic disease. In other words, people who'd had the shot but never had the virus were 13 times more likely to get COVID than people who had natural immunity. So in the previous article, they're just blatantly lying and they know it. Here we have another highly sensationalist headline from the Daily Mail. COVID jabs can protect patients by giving them antibodies against 21 other viruses, including potentially fatal SARS and MERS. Pfizer and Moderna vaccines protect against SARS and MERS, US study found. Skipping down to the third paragraph in the article, SARS is a respiratory virus that began spreading in China in 2002, killing around 1 in 10 of those infected. MERS is also a respiratory syndrome which was first detected in Saudi Arabia in 2012 and kills around 1 in 3 of those infected. Well, the SARS-1 virus has been extinct since 2004, so that's not a threat to anyone. And as I understand it, MERS is confined to the Middle East. It's not very transmissible and you can only get it through contact with camels, so it's not a threat to most people. But they don't mention that in the article. They want people to fear for their lives so they'll take the needle. They're really overselling it. This is eerily reminiscent of propaganda from the initial rollout. I think we're going to see another hard push for everyone to get injected. Here's another Daily Mail article. COVID jab rollout brought forward over fears of new variant. England's annual flu and COVID vaccine drive is being brought forward due to fears the heavily mutated Parola variant will trigger a fresh wave and overwhelm the NHS. They keep trotting out the same old lines from 2020. This new wave could overwhelm the health system. The prophets of doom and their unfulfilled prophecies, eh? Of course, they expect us to protect the health system with our lives and freedom. You'll also notice the comments are turned off for this article. This is another disturbing new trend. They had been easing off a little on censorship, but now they are stepping it up again. MSN doesn't want us criticising the efficacy of the injection, or questioning why in the last few weeks we've been seeing a surge in COVID propaganda. Next article. Updated COVID vaccines are nearly ready, as alarm grows over new variants' rapid spread. Updated COVID vaccines are expected to become available in the US this month, as alarm grows over a new variant dubbed Eris. So who's alarmed? Why should we be alarmed? They're telling you to be alarmed, and sadly most people are highly impressionable. Skipping down to paragraph 4. It comes as providers and pharmacies prepare to roll out an updated vaccine designed to combat Omicron. But experts are not very optimistic that the greater majority of Americans will opt to be vaccinated. So they're trying to create fear that not enough people will get the injection. The implication is that if people won't take it voluntarily, perhaps they should be encouraged. They want people to think COVID is still a threat, that you need the injection, and some people thought this kind of hysteria was a thing of the past. Let's look at another article. Lockdowns and face masks unequivocally cut the spread of COVID, report finds. Royal Society review looks at non-pharmaceutical interventions when applied in packages of several measures. This article is based on a report published in August of 2023. I find the timing very suspicious. They're manufacturing evidence again so they can claim they're following the science, following the best medical advice. Scrolling through these articles has been like going back in time to 2020 and 2021. The sheer volume, quality, and tone of the propaganda is eerily reminiscent of those times. My newsfeed has been flooded with articles like these. Why has there been such a concerted effort to bring COVID back to the forefront of people's minds? Repetition is itself a propaganda technique. Has this current propaganda campaign had the desired effect, though? Let's take a look at a few more articles. This article's from the 25th of August. 4 months after healthcare mask mandate dropped, a protest calls for its return. Do No Harm BC, a non-partisan COVID-19 safety advocacy group, is set to host a protest on Monday aimed at returning masks to healthcare settings. The masked protest will take place outside Provincial Health Minister Adrian Dix's constituency office at 12 p.m, with healthcare workers, patients and caregivers set to tell their stories. It's now obvious we've started a COVID surge with a new variant, right when flu and RSV are about to hit, says Dr. Karina Ziedler, a family physician and co-founder of Protect Our Province BC, in a statement. Our healthcare system is on its knees. We have the tools and we need to use them. Not restoring mask protections to healthcare would be criminal. Masks became optional in healthcare settings on April 6, when Provincial Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Henry dropped the mask mandate. At the time, workers and patients raised their concerns that it could lead to the spread of COVID-19 to immunocompromised people in hospitals. Removing masks from healthcare was strongly criticised by BC's Human Rights Commissioner, Kazari Govender, who wrote, The minor inconvenience masks cause for some must be balanced against the more profound harms to the rights of marginalised people to participate in society, and in this case to access healthcare. Do No Harm has been collecting stories from people affected by the lack of mask mandates in healthcare. As part of their Postcards for Public Health campaign, the group has encouraged people to call for a return to masks in healthcare by writing messages on postcards. These will be delivered to Dix's office on Monday as part of the protest. Hannah Seiden, a Vancouver resident with upcoming surgery, said in a statement that the lack of masks made it impossible for her to access care safely. My underlying condition worsened in the wake of multiple viral infections, resulting in the need for this surgery. I shouldn't have to worry whether I'll be given another virus and more health damage while I'm at the hospital. Although there are no COVID protective measures currently in place in BC, COVID-19 remains in circulation. Immunocompromised, disabled, elderly and high-risk people are more likely to have severe health impacts from a COVID-19 infection, such as developing long COVID, requiring hospitalisation, or experiencing long-term health problems, though these can happen to low-risk individuals too. Danielle Gould, a healthcare worker who has both chronic and acute health conditions, is also concerned that vulnerable people are more at risk of harm due to the lack of mask mandates. Post-mask mandate healthcare has become unsafe for me, but I have no choice but to access it anyway, she said. No one should have to risk easily avoidable, predictable harm for necessary care. Health experts have warned that fall will likely see an uptick in COVID-19 cases. The World Health Organization currently recommends that if COVID-19 is circulating, masks be worn in healthcare settings by all workers, patients, and visitors. So the current propaganda campaign seems to have whipped up enough hysteria to get some people out to protest for the return of mask mandates. There's probably an element of astroturfing here too. But what happened at this protest? Let's take a look. When unhinged mask protesters attack. On Monday, August 28, 2023, a group of protesters calling for a return to mandatory masks gathered out front of the BC Minister of Health's office to demand that mandatory mask mandates return in BC. Just moments into the demonstration, a man holding signs contrary to their beliefs was attacked by two of the masked protesters who tried to destroy his signs and silence his free speech. In this video, Dan Dix of Press for Truth was there to document the entire event, so that we can counter the lies that the MSM will undoubtedly publish. The truth is these people are insane, and the footage clearly speaks for itself. So a counter-protester had his sign stolen and was beaten up and chased off. I'm not going to show the video here on YouTube. I have watched it and it's not very nice, but it is posted on pressfortruth.ca. It just goes to show that the hysteria is reaching fever pitch again, and 2020 taught us just how contagious hysteria can be. Recently, a Canadian woman named Sheila Annette Lewis passed away because she was denied an organ transplant because of her vaccination status. The fact that she was denied a transplant shows that at least some vestige of the injection mandates are still in place. In response to the news of her death, Canadian MP Charlie Angus of the NDP tweeted, "A woman died because she preferred to fight for disinformation, anti-vax bullshit and conspiracy." He's quite happy to dance on her grave. If you thought this sort of vitriol was behind us, you are sorely mistaken. I conclude that the recent propaganda campaign has been successful in whipping up hysteria, but has it had any other tangible effects? Trump's COVID czar warns Americans are dangerously underestimating surge. 2 or 3 of your friends have it. Let's first take a look at the video embedded at the top of the article.
We're talking about COVID-19 again because a late summer wave of COVID-19 infections is actually now impacting the nation's back-to-school season.
Yeah, not what we want to hear. As Fox's Cassie Stegall reports, it comes as healthcare experts warn of a COVID surge this fall and winter.
The White House says it is ready for a fall-winter COVID-19 surge. It comes as the CDC reported a nearly 22% increase in COVID hospitalizations for early August, a percentage it predicts will continue rising as new subvariants.
They're really riffing on increased hospitalizations, just like they did in the lockdown era. Note the nurse in the hazmat suit. They're showing footage and imagery from 2020. They're trying to evoke memories and emotions from that time.
Take hold. The White House, however, downplayed concerns of a new surge this week.
Note the loaded language. Downplayed concerns implies the situation is more serious than they're letting on.
While the CDC is reporting an increase in infections and hospital admissions overall remains low.
And while infection rates are nowhere near pandemic levels, the spike in cases comes just as the back-to-school season picks up. 2 districts in Kentucky and 1 in Texas already had to cancel in-person classes due to a rise in illnesses.
So 3 school districts have cancelled in-person classes, even though they just said infection rates are nowhere near pandemic levels. So why did they do it?
Attendance reportedly low due not to only COVID-19, but also the flu and RSV.
All 3 represent a serious risk of hospitalization, be admitted to the ICU, or even dying.
Fears of a triple-demic.
So they've revived the triple-demic boogeyman, something they tried to scare us with last year and which never materialised. The doctor said COVID, flu and RSV all pose a serious threat of hospitalisation, being admitted to the ICU and dying. This is simply not true, and it's especially not true of children. Now the doctor doesn't explicitly say COVID is a serious threat to children, but the way this interview is spliced into a segment about children returning to school gives that impression.
Now have doctors on alert, many reminding the public to practice good hygiene, washing their hands frequently, and masking up if they are immunocompromised. Healthcare experts, as well as the White House, also urging Americans to vaccinate.
They end by recommending hand washing, masking and getting boosted. A full suite of 2020-style measures, some of which have already been introduced.
Get vaccinated early. You need time for your body to develop the immunity to these and provide the most protection possible.
The White House says updated COVID boosters could be available by mid-September, of course tweaked to fight those new subvariants.
Okay, now reading the article that was under that video. Dr. Birx criticised the Biden administration's response plan, claiming that the boosters set to roll out in September will come too late. What does it mean when someone recommends a fall vaccination? It means that you're ignoring the summer wave, she said. So they're saying that autumn is too late to get boosted. They want you to be worried about COVID even in summer. They want you to be worried all year round. She said the current vaccination strategy the US is employing, by which everyone gets an annual shot before a potential winter surge, isn't ideal for protecting people against COVID-19. It shouldn't have been modelled off the influenza vaccine strategy, Dr. Birx said. Instead, she argued the US should use mRNA technology to quickly tailor boosters to new variants no matter what the time of year they emerge. So we should be worried all year round and getting boosted all year round, whenever there's a new variant. We are seeing a return to restrictions in some settings already. Dublin Hospital reintroduces visitor restrictions over worrying COVID outbreak. Atlanta-based Morris Brown College says they are reinstating COVID mask mandates. The historically black college posted a note on its official Instagram account noting that the protocols would be in effect for the next 14 days. Sounds like 2 weeks to flatten the curve to me. This includes a requirement for mask wearing by students and employees, physical distancing, contact tracing, and other significant efforts to reduce the spread of COVID-19 among the population on the Atlanta campus. So they've reintroduced a full complement of 2020 restrictions. Restrictions that they know don't work for a virus they know is not deadly, yet they're bringing them back anyway. We saw this pattern in 2020. Restrictions were introduced incrementally. At first, wearing a mask would be voluntary. It was just a recommendation. Then businesses and schools would make them mandatory. Then governments would make them mandatory across the board. Restrictions are back. And for those who said they wouldn't get away with it again, I haven't seen any protests in the street over this. This article is from the 25th of August 2023. I'm always very suspicious whenever they loudly announce that they're not going to do something. No support for viral claim that COVID-19 lockdowns are returning this fall. Note the quotation marks around the word lockdowns. The US is seeing an uptick in COVID-19 cases, so it may be prudent for people to wear masks when out in public and take a few extra precautions. But the government is not planning to implement mask mandates or lockdowns, despite claims from the conspiracy theorist Alex Jones. It's actually not the claims by Alex Jones that have me convinced the government is planning to implement lockdowns. It's actually the mainstream media articles we've been looking at in this video. Why are they suddenly drawing attention to case numbers and advising people to wear masks? In 2020 and 2021, all COVID measures started off as recommendations. It was a recommendation to stay home, then it became mandatory to stay home. It was recommended to wear a mask, then it became mandatory to wear a mask. It was recommended to get the needle, then it became mandatory to get the needle. And each time they made a recommendation, the fact checkers would come out and tell us there was no reason to believe it would become mandatory. We've seen this pattern before. By the time measures are in place, it's too late to say anything. It's very hard to reverse course. The purpose of this article is to get you to stay silent. The article continues. In recent weeks, COVID-19 cases, as estimated from wastewater data, and COVID-19 hospitalizations have been on the rise in the US. This comes as the Omicron variant EG5, recently designated as a variant of interest by the World Health Organization, became the newly dominant variant in the country. It's a bit of a digression, but the fact that the government regularly tests wastewater is an outrage. They apparently test for all kinds of viruses and traces of drugs. They could be collecting DNA data as well. Anyway, skipping down a bit. In a few limited instances, colleges and companies have announced they will be requiring masks for the time being. So mandates are back in some settings, as we've seen. But contrary to many viral social media posts, there is no indication that any kind of government-ordered COVID-19 restrictions are about to begin. In an August 18th episode of The Alex Jones Show, the conspiracy theorist Alex Jones claimed sources within the federal government told him new lockdowns are coming. Specifically, he said a high-level manager in the Transportation Security Administration told him that by mid-September, TSA and airport employees would be required to wear masks due to concerns over the new variant in Canada. By mid-October, everyone would have to wear masks on planes, he said. He added that the public should expect by December a return to full COVID protocols. Jones then claimed that he called a source within Customs and Border Protection after hearing this, and the source allegedly told him to expect COVID protocols to begin rolling out in mid-September, and to get ready for a whole new rollout of what happened before. Now, I don't know if Jones's prediction will come true. I don't have access to his sources. He has been right in the past, but he is potentially setting himself up for failure by naming dates. But notice what they are trying to do here. They are trying to get you to be afraid of making a false prediction. I'm not making a prediction. I don't have contacts in high places. I'm extrapolating from patterns I saw in 2020 and 2021. The article has a subsection titled, No Basis for Returning COVID-19 Restrictions. To claim that there is no basis is a lie. The basis is all the mainstream articles I've shared and observing previous patterns of behaviour from 2020. Further down in the article they say, moreover, all the talk of the Biden administration reimposing lockdowns is not even legally feasible. The restrictions that were put into place on businesses, on going to the movie theatre, on going to the retail mall, all of these were done by states and local governments, not the federal government, Wendy E. Palmer, a public health law expert at Northeastern University, told us in a phone interview. So they're trying to placate us by telling us it's not legally feasible. I'll have more on this later, but for now I'll point out that she's only saying the federal government can't impose lockdown. The states can, by implication. Reading on, the federal government did advise states on restrictions, including when to lift them, and guided Americans on what they should and should not do to stay safe. But ultimately, these were just suggestions. So she's rewriting history there. There were federal level mask mandates and travel restrictions as well. The next comment made my blood boil. It's conspiracy thinking and it's catastrophizing, Parmet said of Jones's claims. Well, it's not conspiracy thinking if Jones has reliable sources. And who's catastrophizing? What about all the people who want to spend the rest of their lives hiding under the bed covers from a virus with a fatality rate close to zero? Parmet added that the restrictions in the US, which included business closures and limits on gathering sizes, were not true lockdowns, such as those imposed in China. The lockdown terminology is certainly a misnomer, she said. Just look at the gaslighting here. Not real lockdowns. Our own governments called them lockdowns, by the way. She claims Alex Jones is catastrophizing, but why is she minimizing? Why does she want us to think the lockdowns we had in the West in 2020 weren't that bad? The only reason I can think of is that she is preparing us for them to return. She's also reinforcing the false China versus the West dichotomy. 2020 proved that there is no material difference between the CCP and Western democratic governments. Here's another so-called fact check. No, Dr. Fauci didn't say unvaccinated must be locked down this winter. An August 2023 article by the People's Voice claims a prominent doctor warned of the need for impending lockdowns for unvaccinated people. Fauci declares that all unvaccinated citizens must be locked down this winter, reads the article's headline. Now, I hadn't even heard this specific claim before reading this fact-check article. Why are they bringing it to people's attention? It's a preemptive measure. They want to quell any objections before you can raise them. Getting back to the idea of fact-checkers assuring us that lockdowns or mandates aren't legally feasible, here's a fact-check article from 2020. Could the government make a COVID-19 vaccine mandatory in Australia? When Prime Minister Scott Morrison told Melbourne radio station 3AW a COVID-19 vaccine would be as mandatory as you could possibly make it, there was an immediate backlash from some groups. Mr. Morrison even went as far as to suggest the grounds by which exemptions should be granted. There are always exemptions for any vaccine on medical grounds, but that should be the only basis, he said. A few hours later, talking on Sydney radio station 2GB, Mr. Morrison made a sharp departure from his earlier comments, ruling out a compulsory vaccine. It's not going to be compulsory to have the vaccine, he said. Enforcing mandatory vaccination is a complicated proposition, intersecting public health, rights to bodily autonomy, and medical ethics. Following the signing of a $1.7 billion deal for the right to produce a vaccine being developed by UK-based pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca, our MIT ABC Fact Check takes a look at whether mandatory vaccination could be enforced in Australia. So this is a common propaganda tactic. They float an idea. In this case, the Prime Minister says the injection will be mandatory when it comes out. Then he backflips. And then they bring out a fact-check article to preemptively raise legal and human rights concerns to try to quell people's fears. Let's read on. But Dr. O'Brien makes an important distinction between executive powers that are enforceable on an individual basis and a population-wide mandate as initially suggested by Mr. Morrison. The powers are narrow and are designed to account for specific situations. As each direction would currently have to be justified and issued on an individual basis, it would be logistically fraught. I don't think they could ever be used for a situation like the COVID vaccine, where the aim would be to get hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people vaccinated, she said. Dr. O'Brien added that such executive powers often carried limitations and could be challenged in court. They are generally subject to some form of review, couched in terms of being powers of last resort and not directly enforceable. You couldn't be held down, she said. So this was a fact-check article from 2020, basically saying, relax, they're not going to bring in injection mandates, but if they do, it won't be on a large scale. The article continues. Victoria, Queensland and the Australian Capital Territory could face added complications when legislating for a population-wide vaccination, as each jurisdiction has a Charter of Human Rights which may be incompatible with a mandatory program. The director of the Caston Centre for Human Rights Law, Kevin Bell, told Fact Check there were potential human rights issues surrounding such a vaccination program. There is no question that general compulsory vaccination laws limit human rights in fundamental ways, he said in an email. Final paragraph. However, he added, in my view, we are some way from having an evidence-based foundation for the conclusion that a general compulsory vaccination program is a justified limitation on human rights. So they raise human rights concerns in the article as a preemptive measure. Of course, we all know what happened in Australia. Human rights were thrown out the window and mandates were brought in. And even some people who had medical exemptions or a bad reaction to the first shot were forced to get it. So sometimes fact-check articles are used to preemptively silence critics of a policy that the establishment has already decided to go ahead with. Next up, let's look at some counter-examples. The majority of articles we've looked at so far are hinting at a return to restrictions. But even in 2020, they would pepper their propaganda with a few stories that might make things seem not so bad. Take a look at this one. China plans to ditch the last of its COVID-era measures requiring negative tests for visitors. The title seems encouraging, but if we really look at it, this is nothing. This is China. They can reintroduce restrictions at the drop of a hat. In 2022, when most other countries were beginning to talk about living with COVID, China adopted a zero COVID policy and reintroduced harsh lockdowns. They can do whatever they want, whenever they want. Take a look at this article from Australia. The controversial 408 pandemic visa for international students is being scrapped. The pandemic event visa, subclass 408, is being closed to new applicants, Minister for Immigration Andrew Giles has announced, as the government moves to close off visa categories created in 2020. Again, the headline sounds encouraging. They're going to abolish a pandemic measure. But when you read the article, you find they are just abolishing the pandemic event visa. It's not something that greatly restricted freedom anyway. They've made a show of announcing that they've scrapped a measure, but it's basically nothing. And I'd like to know why these measures weren't abolished earlier, in China and in Australia. What possible justification could they have had for keeping them in place for so long? Why are they announcing this now? Here's another apparent counterexample. This is from news.com.au. Queensland to drop vaccine requirements for health workers. One state has announced a major backflip on a strict pandemic vaccination rule, and the timing hasn't gone down well with everyone. A state government has announced a major U-turn in its COVID-19 vaccination policy. Queensland health workers will no longer be required to be vaccinated against COVID, Queensland Health Minister Shannon Fentiman confirmed in a press conference on Friday. The decision was made based on advice from Chief Health Officer John Gerard, who said the mandate was no longer necessary according to Ms. Fentiman. About 1,200 staff had been dismissed for refusing to get vaccinated, Ms. Fentiman said, adding that possibly several hundred more had resigned over the issue. Just goes to show the effects of mandates on the health system and people's lives is still ongoing. Carrying on with the article, those who lost their jobs would not automatically get them back, they were warned. Anyone who either decided to resign or was terminated because they chose not to comply with the directive is certainly welcome to reapply, Queensland Health Director Michael Walsh. Mr. Walsh confirmed there would be a mandatory consultation period with staff, and the decision to drop the vaccine mandate would likely be finalised by September 25th. The announcement prompted an angry reaction. There's so much wrong with how long this has taken. Don't expect to get those amazing workers back. You've hurt them in ways that are unforgivable, one user wrote on Facebook. Make a mental note of the context here, where a Facebook user describes the mandates as unforgivable. But describing COVID as no longer a public health emergency, Ms. Fentiman said it was the right time to repeal the restrictions. Given the high vaccination rates in Queensland and the fact that we have high immunity across our population, the CHO has determined it is reasonable to consider removing the mandate, Ms. Fentiman said. Despite this, Acting Chief Health Officer Catherine McDougall urged Queenslanders, particularly the elderly, to keep getting vaccinated. This is a serious disease that particularly risks our elderly and our vulnerable, Dr. McDougall said. Out of the 600 people over 65 hospitalised with COVID in July and August this year, 70% were not up to date with their boosters. Vaccination against COVID is still a requirement for healthcare workers in Victoria and New South Wales, so make a note of that as well. The injection is still mandatory for healthcare workers in Victoria and New South Wales. So on the surface, this seems to be good news. Mandates are being lifted. They're surely not planning to bring them back. The title of the article was Queensland to drop vaccine requirement for health workers. However, the preview for this article in my newsfeed had the headline, Unforgiveable, State's Major COVID Backflip. This is a very misleading title. Remember, many people just skim the headlines. Some might come away with the impression that Queensland's backflip on COVID policy is unforgivable. The preview is designed to colour the reader's interpretation. If they skim the article through that coloured lens, they might think Queensland shouldn't be lifting mandates now. After all, Victoria and New South Wales still have mandates, and there are scary new variants coming. So why does the media publish apparent counterexamples like this? First, to provide false hope. Even seemingly good news is propaganda. It's just as much designed to create a false impression as all the doom and gloom articles. There's a reason why they're publishing it. When you look more closely at these articles, most of them are just fluff, or they have a more sinister intent like the previous article where they want to cast the lifting of injection mandates in a negative light. But some people who don't want restrictions to return might read these articles and think they're not going to bring back restrictions if they're lifting old ones. Second, to keep people talking about restrictions, keep it in their minds, to remind them of what life was like in 2020 and 2021 and prepare them for a return to those times. To create a sense of panic, and I think this gives us a clue as to why there are a handful of articles announcing the reversal of some COVID measures. There are currently a slew of articles reporting on and recommending the reintroduction of restrictions. Any articles to the contrary stand out as the exception. It creates a dissonance. Remember in 2020, before lockdowns, when at first we were simply advised to stay indoors? All the experts were saying we should avoid large gatherings. But then the media showed us footage of crowds of young people at the beach ignoring the health advice, which created mass hysteria. Those going against health advice were labelled selfish. They're killing us, people said. People begged for lockdown. The purpose of showing crowds at the beach was not to inspire confidence to get outside. It was to get people to beg for the restrictions the government wanted to impose. To lock in restrictions. There could be a longer game here as well. Perhaps they are going to abolish these policies only to bring them back again very soon. Then they'll say, wouldn't it be easier if we just kept these policies in place permanently? Look what happened last time. We had them in place for 3 years, and just when we thought it was all over, we abolished them only to have to bring them back again. Next up, we have a video from 2020. I think it illustrates how the media begged for lockdowns, how they tricked the public into begging for lockdowns, how the government at first pretended they weren't going to impose lockdowns. It's very similar to what we're seeing now. Let's watch.
Why is the government doing nothing to lock down this country that bears any relation to what most other countries are doing? Why is it that Spain, that France, that Italy, that Belgium, that all these other countries around us in Europe are in almost total lockdown, and we are seeing these catastrophically stupid scenes all over the country of people piling into pubs last week where the Cheltenham Festival wasn't cancelled? We've seen all weekend people going out partying like it's a bank holiday, and still the Prime Minister stands at that podium and says, my advice is that you don't do this. People are not listening to his advice. They want clear direction, these people, because they're too stupid to make that decision themselves. We are risking lives, in my humble opinion, and by all means, tell me I'm wrong, but I think every day we are not locking down properly as a country, we are putting the very health workers that you're talking about at greater risk.
Well, I share your frustration, Piers. And over the weekend, I signed new laws to allow police to enforce the bans on pubs and clubs and restaurants. And as we've seen, the number of people not following the advice is incredibly damaging to the effort to stop the spread of the virus.
How are you going to feel if the UK death rate explodes like it has done in Italy because you simply didn't lock down the country properly and because you allowed non-essential workers to all stream out to work? Will you feel responsible as a government for that?
Well, look, these are very difficult and fine judgments, but we have to be guided by medical opinion from the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor. We're fortunate to have world-class advice, and it is essential to implement each of the measures at the right time for this country. Each country, as I say, is on a different course. We're at different stages of the virus. We believe that we're taking the judgments at the right moment. Of course, we'll only know whether that was right.
You're building field hospitals.
That's what we believe that we're doing.
You're building military-style field hospitals in this country with thousands of beds because you know what's coming. You know a virtual form of apocalypse is coming.
Here's another apparent counterexample. New Texas law bans COVID mask, vaccine and shutdown mandates, but some Republicans want more. The bill, recently signed by Governor Greg Abbott and set to take effect on September 1st, does not restrict pandemic rules by private entities. I'm very skeptical about this. Perhaps Texas will be an outlier like Sweden was, although talk is cheap. If you remember the first video we watched, one of the school districts that cancelled in-person classes was in Texas. We'll see what happens if mandates are brought back and they are put under pressure from the federal government and Big Pharma. And by the way, private entities can still impose restrictions. Laws can be repealed. It's also worth noting that many countries that imposed lockdowns supposedly had protections for human rights. Canada, for example, has a Charter of Rights, yet they imposed some of the harshest lockdowns and mandates. The UK has a Bill of Rights, yet they also imposed harsh lockdowns. The US has certain rights protected in its constitution, yet 50 states still went into lockdown in 2020, including Texas and Florida, so we'll see. A constitutional Bill of Rights is a restraining order against the government and provides about as much protection as a restraining order. It's just a piece of paper. That said, I have nothing against the people of Texas. If they can stay out of lockdown, good for them. Let's take a look at another article. Trump blasts fear-mongering over new COVID strain and claims left-wing lunatics are trying to bring back lockdowns and mask mandates to steal the 2024 election. Former President Donald Trump on Thursday criticised the fear-mongering over a new COVID strain and claimed left-wing lunatics are trying to bring back lockdowns and mask mandates to steal the 2024 election. I'm skeptical of this theory. I know it's gained a bit of traction in alt media circles, but I'd like to address several issues. Trump wasn't a threat to the establishment during his first term in office. He didn't drain the swamp like he said. What will be different this time? Why is he such a threat that they'd have to lock down the whole country? Trump is not anti-establishment. Trump is the establishment. Trump initially supported lockdowns as well, don't forget. Trump funded Operation Warp Speed and has actively peddled the needle. Trump may be prevented from running in 2024 anyway, depending on what happens with his legal cases or his health. He is an aging man after all. This theory also doesn't explain why lockdowns and other restrictions continued well into 2022, well after Trump was out of office. It doesn't explain why China spent most of 2022 in harsh lockdown, pursuing a strict zero COVID policy. It's also probably a bit early to be bringing back lockdowns in the hope of influencing the 2024 election, given that the public has such a short memory. It would mean about half of Biden's term in office was spent under some form of restrictions. The establishment also has less elaborate, less costly, more efficient ways of getting rid of unwanted presidents or presidential candidates. I also don't buy the related theory that the COVID regime was a containment mechanism for right-wing populism. It was already pretty well contained in 2019. It was struggling to make headway. This theory also ignores the fact that lockdown is an end, not a means to an end. Be it a COVID lockdown or a climate lockdown, the establishment wants you living under some form of lockdown more often than not. It's not just something they're going to bring out during election season. The kernel of truth in this theory is maybe it's a way to shore up Democrats' support for lockdowns and other restrictions. It certainly seems to be marketed that way. Now, I've heard some people in the alt media downplay concerns about a return to lockdown. Let's look at this clip from the episode of New World Next Week that aired on the 25th of August on CorbettReport.com, and we'll address some criticisms. Now, I like James Corbett. I regularly watch his content, but I disagree with him here. Let's watch.
So those warning we're in for another pandemic aren't panicking over nothing. There's no smoke without fire, and there's definitely a lot of smoke. A lot of suspicious smoke, you might say. An orgy of evidence, always kind of sketchy. And given how watchful COVID skeptics are likely to be, for the establishment to advertise their false flag events in advance would probably be a tactical error.
The establishment isn't afraid to advertise its plans. No one listens to lockdown skeptics. They weren't exactly subtle in 2020 either. They were about as subtle as a sledgehammer.
But as it seems, as I think I was throwing shade at last week, the conspiratainment games are really getting to be a lot anymore. Maui, wildfires, lockdowns. Media, of course, doesn't care about Ohio anymore, but why aren't we talking about Putin whacking Wagner today, James?
Yeah, good question. And in fact, yeah, what, East Palestine? Is that in the Middle East or something? Who cares? Whatever. Maui, Lahaina, I don't know what that was all about. Now let's all speculate about what's coming next month. Yeah, it does seem like conspiratainment games sometimes, doesn't it? With people with the attention span of a gnat, directed by a 24/7 social media newsfeed that they cannot think beyond.
James says it sounds like what he calls conspiratainment games, which is propaganda designed to contain opposition from so-called conspiracy theorists. He seems to think all the hype will soon fade from the news cycle, but I'm not so sure. I think this is a concerted propaganda campaign, and it's been going for a good 2.5 to 3 weeks now. And as I explained in my previous video, the COVID regime never really ended. Yes, it has dropped a gear, but it's still been tootling along all this time.
Since we're here responding to this speculative piece, let's speculate a little bit, because I actually kind of hope that they're just going to try a Plandemic 2.0, a Scamdemic 2.0 in the next month or two, and try to do all of the same stuff again. Because I don't know about you, James, but my sense is I don't think it's going to work quite the same way. In fact, that would probably be the stupidest thing that they could do right now, especially given how much their narrative has fallen apart. Yeah, if they try that this time, yeah, 2020 took a lot of people by surprise. It shouldn't have, but it did. But if they try it in 2023, I don't think it's going to work the same way.
James seems to have fallen for the collapsed narrative psyop. The fact that the narrative has collapsed will somehow shield us from a return to lockdowns. Of course, this overlooks the fact that the establishment never had a cohesive narrative to begin with. They didn't have a cohesive narrative in 2020. They didn't have a cohesive narrative in 2021. They don't currently have a cohesive narrative around the war in Ukraine. They don't need a cohesive narrative to impose their will. And yes, the truth has slowly been coming out, but what's come of it? Who has been held accountable? George W. Bush held accountable when the truth came out about the Iraq war? When the weapons of mass destruction narrative collapsed, did it end the war in Iraq? Did it prevent the US from becoming involved in other foreign wars? He seems to think people won't stand for it now. But there hasn't been any change in the fundamental structure of human DNA or human nature in the last 3 years. Most people are still the weak, fearful, gullible people they were 3 years ago. Normie's gonna normie, I guess. And as I've already shown in this video, some restrictions have already been reintroduced and the normies haven't risen up. James seems to be downplaying the seriousness of the situation. What's the moral response? They're floating the idea of committing crimes against humanity. Even if they're not serious this time, threatening to commit crimes against humanity is evil. It is wrong in and of itself, and there's a mountain of evidence to prove that they're doing at least that. It's also worth noting that the establishment might even be better equipped to enforce lockdowns this time. Surely during 2020 they were collecting data and taking notes. Technology has advanced. They have more surveillance infrastructure in place. Digital currencies are coming. To summarise, here's why I think lockdowns and other COVID restrictions are coming back. There is a precedent. We're seeing the same patterns we saw in 2020. There has been a concerted propaganda campaign. You have to ask yourself why. There must be a reason. They're not just doing it for fun. The quantity, quality and tone of the propaganda we're seeing now is eerily reminiscent of the propaganda we saw in 2020. And in 2020, the propaganda was a reliable early indicator of new restrictions. Restrictions are already being incrementally introduced, and restrictions tend to be sticky. They tend to be kept in place on a semi-permanent basis, and they tend to escalate rapidly. I also think lockdowns are coming back because I haven't seen any convincing evidence to the contrary. All the counterexamples we looked at lacked any substance. It seems to be very important to the establishment that we think lockdowns are not coming back. Why is it so important to them that we do nothing in the face of all the signs? We've seen how in the past they've used fact checks to lull people into complacency and preempt opposition. It's also worth noting they were never held accountable for what they did the first time. They got away with it. There is no reason to think they would face repercussions if they did it again. No one was held accountable for the Iraq war scandal. No one was held accountable for the GFC. It's also important to note that people haven't changed. The average normie never changed their mind. They never opened their eyes. They just got tired of wearing a mask and being in lockdown. They didn't comply with mandates and restrictions on principle. They complied out of fear. Likewise, they didn't turn against mandates and restrictions on principle. They turned against them because they got sick of them. But they've had a bit of a break now and they're ready for round two. Now let's consider the alternative. Is it possible that lockdowns are not coming back and this is all just an elaborate ploy? Yes, it is, but I don't think that's likely. If lockdowns don't come back, that's great. I'll be happy. But why are they going through the motions of sending out all the signals of impending lockdown? Is it because they are trying to condition us to ignore the signals, to doubt ourselves? Perhaps so that they can bring in a lockdown next year or some other time. It is also possible that this is a come-on to provoke an extreme response and provide a pretext for clamping down on dissent. Even if they do bring back lockdowns, it's possible that they're trying to provoke a response or carry out a false flag. I think many people who expected that governments couldn't get away with it again because people wouldn't stand for it, the narrative has collapsed. Those people will be outraged when they find themselves back in lockdown, and they may be tempted to do something stupid. I'll also entertain the possibility that it's a distraction so that they can blindside us with something else. With what though, I don't know. So what should we do? Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Work on the assumption that lockdowns are coming back. If we don't go back into lockdown, you've lost nothing. Prepare yourself mentally. Just like last time, the cavalry probably aren't coming. The masses won't rise up in protest. Be prepared to stand alone. Assume there will be panic buying again. Stock up on food and other essential items. Secure your finances. Dissidents could have their assets frozen or seized, like the Canadian Freedom Convoy protesters. If mandates come back, you could lose your job. Get your ducks in a row. Write to your local state and federal MPs. Write to your state senators. Write to your state health minister and the federal health minister. Write to your state premier or territory chief minister. In 2020, most of us were blindsided by the lockdowns and mandates. We didn't see it coming. One thing we can do differently this time is act preemptively. We can speak out before lockdowns are introduced. I think we have a moral obligation to speak out, even if our politicians ignore us and go ahead with restrictions. I also have a change.org petition going, link in the description below. Please sign it if you live in Australia. Find a community of like-minded people. Join a group of dissidents. In Australia, that might be a Stand in the Park group. They started during lockdown and some of them are still running. It could also be a Facebook group or a Telegram group. An in-person group is better than a virtual group, although virtual groups are a good way to be introduced into a group that meets in person. It might involve moving to a different area, like a rural area where the rules aren't enforced as strictly. Do what's best for you, but find a community in which the members help each other out. If lockdowns come back, stand firm in your principles and continue speaking out. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list of things you can do to prepare. Perhaps that's a topic for another video. You've got to take into consideration what's best for you in your circumstances. We've covered a lot of information today. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll be back again soon. For anyone who's interested, I polished the transcript of my previous video and published it as an article on Substack. It's available for free, link in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.
COVID is making a comeback this summer, so many of us would like to leave it in the past, but cases are once again on the rise. So when will new booster shots roll out? Ann Thompson asked the CDC director.
This summer, most Americans left COVID in the past, gathering together once again mask-free. But tonight, signs of a COVID resurgence. Across the country, COVID hospitalizations jumped more than 14% in the most recent week, but far lower than pandemic levels. NBC News medical contributor Dr. Kavita Patel.
What's behind this uptick in COVID that we're seeing?
The main driver of this is a variant that's relatively newer to the scene, EG5. It's easier to give and get, so that makes it kind of easier to pass along.
It's been almost a year since the last COVID booster came out. CDC Director Dr. Mandy Cohen.
The new COVID booster is expected to be approved by the FDA, and then we will make recommendations from the CDC probably by the second or third week of September.
Will it protect against this new strain?
Yes. The booster is tailored to what we are seeing circulating now.
Critics say the federal government is behind once again. People knew there was going to be a COVID resurgence. So why don't we have a booster today? Why do we have to wait until next month?
The way we go about doing just like we do with our flu shots, right? We make sure that we're looking at the ways in which the virus changed. They look at and evaluate that. The FDA is doing its work. We likely will see this as an annual COVID shot, just like the flu shot.
Just in time for fall, when we'll also face RSV. Can you take the flu shot, the COVID booster, and the RSV vaccine all at once?
So for flu and COVID, yes. RSV, again, is only available for older adults. That's one where I'd say talk to your doctor about what's right for you.
So until the new COVID booster comes, get prepared. Stock up on at-home tests. They do cover that new strain. Keep a mask handy in case you're in a crowded place. And most of all, get your shots, COVID, flu, and RSV, all by Halloween to give yourself your best chance of staying healthy.
A reminder that COVID never went away.
Didn't.
And thank you. A
Lester.
reminder that COVID never went away.
Didn't.
And thank you. A
Lester.
reminder that COVID never went away.
Didn't.
And thank you.